because otherwise we'd have to rig it. It's not really that bad because I could just plug it right into the TV. I'm just getting these out of the way.
Okay. And
I mean, everything in my life is dirty and gross, but I want to leave it they definitely don't know the end, and they're just passing the buck. Yep, totally passing the buck. Do we want to? No, we don't want to tape these down because we're gonna move. Yep.
Exactly.
Sorry.
I'll like put a couple tiny little pieces of gaff tape just to keep things controlled once I put the curtain down.
Do we want to move this so that they can? Let's put the curtain in. What do you think? Let's do that now.
Let's do it now.
See where we can place this TV.
Exactly.
Exactly. And usually when it breaks. Oh, sorry. My bad. Broke the rule.
let me just get the PowerPoint sharing 1 second. We should be ready to go then. So let me get this up. It always adds a little bit of complication. If you see anything strange on the screen, I'm controlling it.
Okay. Hello, I'm David. Hi, Katie.
Katie, sorry, I'm just going to put this on full screen and share that so that David can see that, and then I'm going to close that out and I'm going to move that small off to the side like that.
Okay. Cool.
And then, oops, I didn't move it off to the side like I said.
Oh, that's fine.
Keep it
It
bouncing
probably doesn't won't
in
go
the
down.
bottom. So then you should just be able to click on Katie.
It is a PDF.
We were clicking on it earlier, though.
Yeah, so just use the keypad.
Well, yeah, we could just click on with the keypad, with the arrow. Like if David is standing here, he could just click on with the arrow.
Theoretically. I think what happened is the computer thought you were focused on the Zoom and not
On the thing.
on the PowerPoint.
Oh,
So it
okay.
was like, I can't click through Zoom.
Okay.
So if I have, so if anything happens, I should just click on the screen somewhere.
Yeah, I
I'll
think
also
that
be
that's
sitting right over there.
Okay,
So,
good.
okay.
Worst case scenario. I'll just
Between
worry
us
and
all,
see.
we'll figure it out.
And just so both of you know, my talk starts with a little subtle performance that is not going to be entirely expected. So
Oh, okay.
Okay.
if that when that happens, don't worry about it. It's intentional.
Okay.
But don't tell me.
Will you stand out there for that or here?
It'll be. I'll be sitting down here. I'm assuming as the rest
Yep,
getting on.
sitting-
So it'll happen as I'm coming out.
Okay.
Just a couple things I want to let you know.
Yep.
Don't walk too close to the curtain line. Just
Okay.
because.
There's a wooden thing behind it. We won't catch that on the Zoom.
And I don't want you to actually pick
Oh
up.
no, sorry, don't worry.
The other thing is you don't have to
My question was.
turn the mic on and off. I'm just gonna have it muted on the little board up there.
I would suggest making yourself the host or co-host because it's asking to allow people.
That's the co-host, and I've got the host out at the registration desk.
That's it.
Da-
And I mean, we can make it. I can get you a longer cable if you want, so that they can see the TV. But really, whatever's on the TV
is
is on.
on there. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. And you tested it just to make sure that you're.
Yep, they did that then. David, if you don't mind, I'm going to run back out to the registration desk. Sorry to be.
It looks like the gentleman that was there has control of it. He's all right. Yeah, you know, it seemed like it. I like it. Okay. All right. Sorry. Hi, Jordan. I run the media, so
David.
TVs or audio the shit.
Okay. Well,
And Katie.
So the talks about using failure as a way of sort of reimagining.
Oh, I like this built in. So if something goes wrong.
Well, yeah, that's one thing. But so I actually will start by tripping and making it look like I'm officially
Plenty of things to
fucking
trip
up
on.
here. So just be aware you don't need to rush out. And help
Right
me.
there is your opportunity.
Yeah,
I was about to
it'll be
say.
there, and I'm glad that this is actually a stage because I've done it a couple times before. But the whole point is what happens.
The only thing that the people on Zoom won't be able to necessarily see it unless you do it
Yeah, no, well, and that's
like
okay.
here. And your
No,
thing's on a power.
I've been teaching hybrid site.
This thing's on a PDF,
It's not PDF.
but the clip here.
We were just clicking.
Oh, okay. Why am I in here? I can go home.
Yep.
Goodbye. No.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, we're still good.
But Katie's your one person who was actually wrong. Legitimate. Not gonna be floating in between children singing next door. So.
Oh yeah, that's going on.
Sounds a lot worse than good college days.
Oh, good. Do you want to store any of that backstage? You can or can't. There's also a big shelf right here that has nothing on it. Yeah.
It's gonna be wet even more.
Yeah.
Later on. Yeah.
Sometimes. supposedly like 9, and then they're supposed to open house in a couple minutes. But there's also only, I think they said 50, 70 people. So they might just be waiting until they have more of a quorum before they start opening the doors.
We decided against tipping things down.
Are you going to be walking through here, this back portion?
Think so.
And is anybody?
The mic's here, right? So
Yeah.
I don't think I will.
Okay. I'm trying not to tape down the wires too much because we do have to move this.
Yeah, the whole thing has to disappear
Yeah.
right after your.
So just be aware that there's a cable here and a cable here.
Yep.
Okay. Great.
Another Plenary?
Another, sorry?
Another Plenary?
We don't know.
Tasman.
It's not our.
Oh, okay.
We just know that at 11:30 there's a hard out for another event that has to come in here after you.
Yeah.
After everything here, and
So we
then
have to kind of move
and
this
then-
back and then move it for your next session.
and then you come in again after that.
Got it. Okay. Sorry.
You're fine.
I'm just ahead.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, of course.
Okay. Perfect.
The menu.
Put on more.
Hide. Video. Oh no. Oh, go back. Don't do that. Show video now. Hide floating. Should still be showing.
Yeah, no, that actually happened right before you showed up. They were like, "Why isn't the clicker working?" I was like, "Oh, because Zoom isn't the program selected."
Yeah.
Or not Zoom, the PDF.
I just want to make sure.
Oh my god, that's so funny. Looking at the light changing on the number line over there. It's like bright green. Not bright green.
That was
Yeah.
That's what I was telling you about it. I just hope it's on the Zoom call.
I can see it in the corner. It says
Talking? Okay, cool.
so. Should be fine.
Yes, they can still exist.
Hello? Not on. Ah, there it is. Good morning, everyone. This is very spooky lighting. It feels very pre-Halloween to me, but you're well lit. I feel like I'm a little bit more mysterious. I'm Katie Lebesco, and I'm a professor and associate vice president for strategic initiatives here at Marymount Manhattan College, and one of your local area co-hosts. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the college this morning. I have been on sabbatical, so I haven't been to the building in a few months. So some of you have been here longer than I have by virtue of getting here before I did today. It's very nice to see you. I want to just take a moment. I think he's going to wave Queen style to introduce Peter Naccarato, who is my frequent co-collaborator as a food studies scholar and also my partner in crime as the local area co-host. Peter is our vice president for academic affairs and a professor of English and world literatures. And we are really happy to have been able to host this conference. Some of you may be aware that we tried to do this in 2020, in October of 2020. Something, I don't remember what, something strange happened that disrupted that operation entirely. And so we went virtual for the 2020 conference, but it feels really wonderful to be able to be with a group of scholars in person. And I know we have another fairly decent sized contingent joining us virtually. So I'm really looking forward. This is only my second in-person conference since 2019. So the first one I went to in July, I kind of ran around like a kid in a candy store, and I expect a similar level of energy today. Oh, hi, Aiko. Sorry. Now the hi, Aiko is something that, we met at the conference, the Food Studies Conference, that I think was the 8th, that was in Vancouver, gosh, 4 or 5 years ago at this point. One of the things I want to mention about this conference, if you have never been before, is that it's really a pleasant community of international scholars and really interdisciplinary. And, Aiko and I have been we met in Vancouver, and we've been in touch and, met each other at various sites around the world as we kind of intersect over the last several years. So this is a great place for you to make friends and research contacts you can call on for years. So please don't be shy. I'm certainly not. I know Peter and I welcome the opportunity to interact with everybody who's here today informally, to hear what you're up to, and of course to attend your presentations. One thing that I want to put out into the world is a thank you to the organizers of this conference. Shockingly, that's not me and Peter. We're just kind of we're the locals. we add color, literal color. Our colleagues at Common Ground Research Networks are really the steam engine behind this enterprise, who've done all of the hard organizational work, who've responded to your queries. And Philip and Tamsin have been, fabulous partners to work with. We just, got to come in and say, what would be a good theme? Who are some great speakers on the topics that you're interested in? So I would really like to thank them for all their efforts and encourage you to meet them and get to know them if you haven't already interacted with them this morning. The overall conference theme has to do with the imagination and creativity. And I wanted to give you a little bit of the backstory about what compelled us to do that topic. Really, this weekend, we have the soft opening of the Judith Mara Carson Center for Visual Arts, colloquially known as the Judy. And that is a visual arts center that is opening on the 7th and 8th floors of the building where we just had the coffee, which is called the Carson Building. last time I was at campus was about 4 months ago, and it was a construction site, but I wandered up there first thing this morning, and it is just stunningly beautiful. And there's no guard, so you can just wander up there. If you get the chance, if you have an opportunity between sessions, you'll say, I've never seen anything that looks so clean in New York City before. It's there's not a footprint on the floor. Everything is pristine, as it's just opened as this beautiful arts education space for the college and for the city. So please do check that out. I think I don't need to do a lot of promotion of New York City. I mean, you've come here, you've chosen to venture to a conference in the city, but I hope you'll avail yourself. I hope to see many of you at the I'm calling it the field trip day tomorrow, but I think it has a more formal name. I'm hoping to see you there, and if you didn't sign up and missed the literal boat to the field trip, I hope you'll avail yourself of the opportunity to explore New York. We are so close to Museum Mile, where you could wander over to Central Park on a brief break. The opportunities are endless. So please do. And if you need any tips, good places to eat locally or things to do or see, Peter and I are happy to weigh in. I think that is probably all I wanted to say. I just want to encourage you to attend the plenary sessions. We have great speakers, all of whom were contributors to a book that Peter and I edited a few years ago. So we know they, we know they think brilliant thoughts and are engaging presenters. And I wish you a wonderful conference and look forward to meeting you in person throughout today and tomorrow. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Philip, who's waiting in the dark, creepily.
So, good morning, everybody. We have really forgotten how to do this, haven't we? Good morning, everybody. That's a little better. Well, yes, I would like to welcome you all here to our conference this year. It's a weaving story of how we meet and how these ideas and partnerships come together. We have Karen and Lars in the audience here. They're our hosts last year. It's wonderful to see them back. Katie and I began a conversation about this conference. Yes, I think it was it? Yeah, I've forgotten years. COVID and years has just all gone blank. But it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. So I want to thank Katie and Peter for hosting, but also the kind of work that they do, which inspires us as a research network as well. I'm going to give a really boring technical kind of overview of, well, no, it's not that boring, of what we do here at the Food Studies Research Network. So there's 3 parts to this research network. One is this conference itself. Oh, by the way, I'm Philip Kalantzis-Cope, Chief Social Scientist of Common Ground Research Networks. The conference is a blended conference. We've spent a year, I was talking to Katie before, we spent a year doing online conferences and now we've spent a year doing blended conferences. And one of the things that makes Common Ground Research Networks a little bit different is that we build our own software. And so what we thought when the pandemic hit, what it brought to our mind was not just the kinds of access barriers that a pandemic brings to you, but the kinds of access barriers that have existed in scholarly communication for some time. And so we built a little conference application, which is why we force you into the app here, which we see as a kind of content time capsule. And so the plenary talks are all live. I would like to welcome all of our online delegates for wherever you are, whatever time zone it is. But the bulk of the program is asynchronous digital content. So all of our online delegates have uploaded to their presentation page film, text, PowerPoint, all that kind of thing. But we also encourage you to do this as well. And what we want this to be is a resource that you can come back to. The kind of temporality of what a conference is, you know, 1 day, 2 days, and then you're kind of gone. We were trying to push that boundary. And what we hope is just a resource that you can come back to, A, but B, it means those who couldn't be here, whether they're having a commitment to environmental politics. That's a big reason why people don't want to get on a plane anymore, whether it's health concerns, whether it's, you know, the cost of coming to these kinds of events, is that we want to make sure that as much as that content is captured. So if you've not uploaded your presentation, go home, record yourself, put it up there. You'll see that you all have your own profile pages. You can add people as peers. We don't have friends, we have peers in our ecosystem, and that we hope that these conversations go beyond what the formal presentations are here. Alongside the conference, we have a journal and a book series. One of the things that we try and do with the journals, take seriously the peer review. So what does that mean for us is that we love our editor, we love our advisory board, but we also want to make sure that the validation of the content comes from people within the research network itself. So if you do submit a paper, we then put you into our pool of experts to then be content validators as well. Included in your conference registration is a network membership, which gives you access to the entire backlist of the journal. It's a great resource that I really encourage you to use. We also give you access as part of that to all the book titles we've published, including Karen and Lars' Teaching Taste, which is a wonderful book. So please make sure that you make the most of those resources. There's a group of people that are, another group of people that I want to recognize, and this year's Emerging Scholar awardees. Each year we have an application for this group. We had a great group of applications, and we have a great group of Emerging Scholar awardees. If I could ask them to stand up for 1 second, and we'll give them a round of applause. Don't be shy, come on, it's a theatre. Thank you. So what we do with this program is we make sure that these voices and people are at the front of the room. So they'll be chairing your sessions, they'll be guiding conversations. And again, that's a really important commitment to us. We also want to think, you know, as people come back to these kinds of conferences, how do we do things a little bit differently as well? How do we get you out into the world? And we have a case study day. We should call it something a little hipper than that, right? But if you can think of something other than case study day, then I welcome that suggestion. And so we'll be doing that tomorrow. There is still space, I'm pretty sure. There is a limit to it, but I think we haven't reached that yet. So if you've not signed up, please see Tamsin at the registration desk. And we have a welcome reception this evening here at the venue. One of the other things that we are venturing out into, a brand new world, is that we are offering Spanish language presentation options and publication options. This is the first year we have really done it. And so I think we have 10 Spanish language presentations. If you go to your program, you can see a little drop down and you can go back and forth between those English or Spanish sessions. We're all one conference. Feel free to go to both. There is no barriers between the two. So I want to thank the Spanish language delegates that are here this year for being our pioneers, our brave first group into the world. So let's give them a round of applause. And in doing that, I also want to introduce our Spanish language research network chair, who's also our host for next year's conference, Bianca Rosa Agura Asangia. Asangia? I destroyed it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You can come and help me fix it. I'm sorry.
Good morning. It's a pleasure for me be with you today. Right now, I speak Spanish for the person in Spanish. Buenos días a todos. Es un placer estar hoy aquí presente en estas conferencias de alimentos, ciencias en alimentos. Bueno, mi nombre es Blanca Rosa Aguilar Uscanga. Actualmente fui invitada a ser presidente de la parte de la red Common Group en el habla hispana. Pues pertenezco a lo que es la Universidad de Guadalajara en México. Soy profesor investigador y dentro de mis áreas que trabajo pues es la ciencia de los alimentos, es la tecnología, el desarrollo, la innovación de alimentos funcionales y bueno, y también hacia lo que es el desarrollo de alimentos para la salud. Hoy es un día muy importante y especial pues para mí y para las personas que nos acompañan en lo que es el habla hispana, porque una de las cosas importantes que queremos pues resaltar, hacer un poco más grande lo que es la comunicación en español, igual es importante lo que es el habla inglesa, pero quisiéramos que con estos tipos de congresos, con estas participaciones, colaboraciones académicas que puedan existir entre los diferentes pues universidades o lugares, de hecho empresas que llegaran a estar interesadas en el desarrollo y tecnológico de diferentes alimentos que pudiésemos nosotros presentar aquí en este congreso, pues puedan llegar a repercutir en ampliar pues más lo que es la colaboración hacia el área de los alimentos, pero específicamente al habla hispana. Otra de las cosas que quiero también aprovechar, ya que ahorita estoy aquí con el micrófono, pues es invitarlos y anunciar también que el próximo año pues vamos a tener este congreso, estas conferencias de ciencias de los alimentos en México, en Guadalajara, y va a ser un placer el que puedan ustedes asistir a nuestro evento. Guadalajara, en Jalisco, pues es un lugar muy bonito en donde tenemos mucho tequila y muy buena comida, de good food. Y bueno, también existen dentro de las actividades que podemos nosotros ofrecer, pues es todo lo que es la artesanía, nuestra cultura en general, ¿no? México es un país bonito y esperemos poderlos ver el próximo año allá con nosotros. Y bueno, y pues no me queda más que agradecerles a todos pues su asistencia, el interés de estar aquí hoy en este día participando con todos, tanto en lengua española como en lengua inglesa, en este evento tan importante. Y pues espero que lo disfruten, tanto las conferencias en español como en inglés. Y pues muchas gracias por su participación. Thank you very much.
I did hear good food and tequila, which I vote yes for. One of the big thank yous that I just want to say before I introduce our first plenary speaker is to thank all of you. Or for you to thank yourselves or to appreciate yourselves. Getting to a conference nowadays or presenting your research is a bureaucratic, health, existential, all the layers of weight and stress that have been sitting over us for all this time are real. They are real. And to break through and to keep on doing the work that you do and keep on participating and being back into the world is no small feat. So I really want to, let you all breathe, just to drop your shoulders for a second and appreciate what it's taken to be here, because we appreciate you being here. I'm going to start with the intro. Katie and I divided this up. She said, you can read and I will do something more theatrical. Being the theme and the venue is perfect. Being surrounded by the arts practices of students and faculty here is a great treasure. Please walk around, see what's on the walls, see what's available, and really look at what this institution has to offer its students, this community, and the research world. So being on stage feels appropriate. Okay, so our first keynote speaker is David Szanto. Okay, there we go. He's a teacher, researcher, artist, and consultant taking an experimental approach to gastronomy and food systems. His past projects include meal performances about urban foodscapes, immersive sensory installations, and public interventions involving food, microbes, humans, and digital technology. David has taught about food at Quest University Canada, the University of Ottawa, Concordia, UQAM, and the University of Gastronomic Sciences, and has written numerous articles and chapters on food, art, and performance. He's a regular contributor to the magazine Montreal en Santé. See, the French, everything. I'm just hacking. It's terrible. They're going to send me back to Australia. And he is an associate editor of the open access journal Canadian Food Studies. He is currently editing 2 open access books with colleagues at Carleton, Food Studies, Matter, Meaning, and Movement, and an introductory textbook about food studies and Showing Theory to Know Theory, a collection of illustrative vignettes that help undergraduates understand theoretical concepts and disciplinary jargon in the social sciences. His talk, Baked, Burnt, Curdled, Cultured, Slimy, Succulent, Rebooting Food Epistemologies. Now, the funner intro, or do we just go straight into Dave? Straight into it. Wonderful. There you go.
So how'd that feel when I fall and I trip and I drop things? How does it feel watching someone else fail or make a mistake or screw up? Does it make you feel uncomfortable? Does it make you feel confident? Does it make you feel weird? Does it make you feel like you maybe came to the wrong conference? Is it discomforting to see, to witness failure? How does it feel to do it? How does it feel to not succeed? That's a question. And that's the question that I'm going to try to get into with this talk. Specifically in the context of how we collectively in the food studies community make knowledge, and how sometimes when we try to make knowledge, we succeed. And sometimes we make mistakes. So for now, I'm interested in the latter. I'm interested in making mistakes. I want to get it wrong. I want to be confusing. I'll probably lose my place. I might drop things or trip and fall. And so what I'm going to do is show some examples of how in moments of what seemed like unsuccess that I have participated in, and particularly contexts that involved material practice with food, some interesting things happened and a lot of very good things came about. And then afterwards, I'm hoping that we will talk about it and see what failure might do for the epistemologies of food studies and how we can think about failure in different ways than just not success. It's not about undoing the way we make food studies knowledge, but it's about maybe rebooting it. You know, when your computer starts getting a bit tired or a little weird things start happening and there are artifacts that are not quite appearing as they should on your screen, you think, oh, I'll just restart my computer and reboot it and see if the system starts up again in a slightly cleaner way. And so that's really the starting point for this talk, is to not think how to undo positivist or science-based or masculist framework-based systems of knowledge, but to maybe add to them or to restart the system so that as we continue to do our work, we can think about maybe more pluralistic ways of creating knowledge, more comprehensive ways that actually respond to the systemic nature of food systems, because that is indeed what food is. I often talk about food as being a combination of matter, meaning, and movement, hence the subtitle of the edited volume that I co-produced, because that's really what food is, and that's what food studies probably ought to be as well, more engaged with material, but also thinking about how material and discourse and process all play together and produce what we know about the world and what we know about the food world. Because my concern is, what if objectivity and masculist frameworks and science itself have made us too confident, and that when we think we get it right, we stop investigating, we stop asking questions, we stop worrying about what else there might be to know. There's something problematic about success, I think, because it can make us a little too confident. And at this stage in the field, in the history of our field, I think being too confident is kind of risky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some examples of my work that I think illustrate this, some performance and some installational work, and they involve material practices, as I said, things like fermenting and art and design and performance and eating. Because when we get into the material, we start witnessing sometimes the way our discourse doesn't quite do it, doesn't quite answer all the questions that we might be wanting to answer. And so drawing out some of these effects and the results of this work, I'm hoping to make the idea of failure useful in many areas of practice, whether it's material-based or not, in art and scholarship, in activism, in agriculture, because science, for all of its wonders, could maybe do with a little bit of failure. Philosophy, art, we engage with failure all the time. But the scientists of the world or the positivist researchers might like to try to play with failure as well. And I think also, along a somewhat different but related axis, I think failure can be a very useful way for us as food scholars and practitioners to start to grapple with the very long-term and highly problematic histories of and contemporaries of the effects of colonialism, of Western-centric extractivism, of modernist frameworks of knowledge, because these systems of knowing and also of doing often privilege, order, control, rectilinearity, thinking and saying over sensing and doing. And so as you'll see, I think there's some valuable convergences among failure-based approaches, or non-positivist or pluralist, and the relationality of, for example, indigenous food systems and feminist and queer interpretations, and as well, obviously, systems theory, which takes food as a whole. So one quick clarification that I do want to make is that failure, as I want to talk about it now, and this has been a challenge for me for a very long time to wrap my head around the idea of failure, not as the opposite of success, but as another kind of positive outcome. And it's not just about failure as a step towards success. That's a bit of a cliche, I think. But failure in itself as a good thing. So it's also getting away from the sort of dualistic thinking of failure being the opposite of something. Failure is its own thing. It's another form, another positive kind of outcome. So without getting, what's she doing there? Without getting too chronological, I do want to give just a little bit of a genealogy of this line of thinking, because as I said, wrapping one's head around failure is a very positive thing, is not obvious, not necessarily obvious. And so that's where I come to this lovely person, who is in fact not the person I'm going to speak about. This is my friend Dana, who gave me permission to use this picture, but I thought it was a nice shot. So about 10 years ago, I was chairing a set of thesis defenses at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy. And they were by my master's students. And some of the students in the program were wonderful, brilliant scholars who had discovered food and thought this was going to be their path, and indeed have made it their path in many ways. And one of the students, not Dana, but the person she's filling in here for, wrote a particularly unacademic final paper, her thesis. And it was, I barely passed it, but it was really not so great. It's pretty badly written. And it had no citations. and it was really wandery, and it didn't really start and it didn't really end. But what was extraordinary about it was about this idea of wonder. And this student had come to food for the first time in her life and thought, oh, wow, my brain is opening up in ways that I never thought it would. And I wonder about so much of the world now because of this lens of food that I've taken. And I thought, okay, you've written a terrible thesis, but you've come up with a brilliant idea. And this idea of completely failing to be a good graduate student, but producing an idea that I had never considered in a number of years of academic work in food. And it made me wonder. And I thought, wonder is wonderful. Why can't we wonder some more? So wonder started sticking in my head as a kind of academic failure, but a humanistic or a food systems success. And then I read Lisa Helke's extraordinary chapter, Farming Made Her Stupid, in which she talks about low knowledge and high knowledge, and that a farmer who had been an intellect and started doing work with their hands in food praxis and engaging with materiality started to be considered stupid, or at least unintelligent in the sense of academic knowledge. And that the idea that getting actually into the place where food is made somehow reduces your knowledge credibility. It was fascinating and shocking. And of course, Lisa is a brilliant writer, so it all comes into this wonderful argument for stupid knowledge or unknowing. And so that added to my sense of things. Later, after having finished my dissertation, and I wish I had read this before that, I discovered Jack, then Judith Halberstam's extraordinary book, The Queer Art of Failure, in which they take a completely alternate perspective on what failure could be, how it could be positive. And this is really where I started to crystallize this idea in my head. Oh, this makes so much sense. And it's brilliant. It's a book that takes Pixar movies and the characters from animated kind of popular films and understands failure through those contexts, and then does this whole queer analysis around them, in which failure becomes another kind of positive outcome. Brilliant. So I got very invested in failure after reading this book, and someone recommended to me this, which I highly recommend you all go see, a YouTube video called Failing, a Very Difficult Piece for Solo String Bass, in which the this person on screen performs this piece called Failing, in which we never really know whether they are succeeding or failing to read and follow the score and improvise or not improvise, perform the script, who knows what. And so in this, we get into this idea of, well, how do we recognize failure? And how is failure perceived to be a failure rather than a success? It seems like he's doing a great job, but is he actually failing? And so that upends and twists and perverts all of these possibilities in a brilliant way. And then, much more recently, over the last 10 years, I have completely failed to get a full-time permanent academic position on the tenure track in an academic institution anywhere in the world, although I have taught at many places. And over time, I've come to realize that as one of the happiest, most felicitous outcomes of my academic career, because I'm not stuck in any institution and I'm not beholden to anyone. And that's not just failure has led to my successful positioning myself as a freelance academic. Failure as an academic has taught me that there are failings in the negative sense in much of academia. So I'm now thinking, my failures are my strength. So I started wondering, how can this be more useful in food studies, in our field, in our practices? I wondered about just getting it wrong. And once when I was in a tasting workshop at the University of Gastronomic Sciences when I was doing my master there, I was told that absolutely no, I did not smell green banana in this olive oil. I was wrong. And I really wondered about that. I really wondered, how can someone tell me what I am sensing? And how can I tell someone what they are sensing? I once actually was in a wine tasting workshop with some students and said, I smell broccoli, when I absolutely didn't. And about 30 seconds later, after all my students, respecting me as an authority figure in the room, smelled their wine and they said, oh, I get broccoli too. And then I smelled the wine again and I got broccoli. I thought, what is it about getting it right or being perceived to get it right that can pervert what's actually possibly going on? So I started worrying about these ordering systems, the siloing of knowledge, the masculist frameworks, the structuring, the isolation of variables, the things that science is very good at. And I don't want to get rid of science. I just want to let science be science and let other forms of knowledge making be equally legitimate or valuable. How can we get more complex? That's what I was questioning. In this strange era of post-truth and non-factual facts, it also maybe suggests that failure can be a highly successful modality in lots of places. Politics has adopted failure 100%. So maybe we need to learn some of their techniques as well to fight back meaningfully. So as I went on and started retroactively reflecting on different moments from my own food work through this lens of failure, what had been somewhat sort of messy came into a kind of clarity, not exactly a focus, because focus to me is a little too successful, but that some of these moments resonated with rightness, with a kind of sense of, that's okay. That's good enough. That's failure, but I like it. And so that's why I want to share some of these snapshots with you now and see maybe then afterwards as we talk, how we can maybe engage with failure in meaningful ways, think about it, do it, trip and fall, stand up again, or maybe just stay down. So I'm going to share 3 examples and let's see where we get. And the first one happened when I was in Quito, Ecuador in 2016. And it was part of the Eco Gastronomy Project, which was a semi-world tour that I did in support of promoting the University of Gastronomic Sciences, for which I then worked, but also in terms of sharing a kind of pluralistic understanding of gastronomy. We at the university in Italy had a very European-centered approach, and it was good and interesting and valuable, but then we started wondering, well, how can we reach out to other world cultures? How can we think about gastronomy in our sort of 360 or maybe 320 degree sense? And have a pluralistic conversation with other communities about what gastronomy means to them. And so this was a very much about a sharing of different knowledges, exchanges, kind of decentering maybe Europeanness, decentering David Szanto wandering around the world talking about gastronomy. And so we organized a number of different events around the world. And in Ecuador, we wanted to focus on indigenous and traditional beverages in particular. This was triggered by a couple of my students who were living there at that point, or my former students. And they thought, well, let's see what we can do with this challenge that's happening now, where many people in our country are drinking very highly sugared beverages, a lot of international, transnational pop. There's a sugar tax being levied. What about thinking about some of the fabulous juices and corn-based beverages that have always been part of Ecuadorian culture, and just valorizing them through a short workshop conversation and tasting of them? So we did that. And it was an extraordinary experience for me. I'd never been south of the equator, so I got to eat some extraordinary ceviche and discover this beautiful city. We went and saw this man who was an old-time, very labor-intensive candy maker, these candied peanuts that he was busy roasting over an open brazier. Beautiful experience with my students. We felt like peers. We felt like we were doing this all together. I was discovering some of the beautiful signage and discovering the beautiful taste of the place. And fortunately or unfortunately, I discovered some taste that made me extremely sick. And a combination of altitude poisoning, food poisoning, and a few other things meant that I completely failed to show up to the event. In fact, I did show up and they sent me home because I looked like death warmed over. And indeed, I had a very bad bacterial infection and the next day had to go on an IV drip where the doctors and, in fact, my students were terrified for my health and well-being. And I had something like 8 liters of water pumped back into me because I just wasn't paying attention. But on the night of the event, after I left, a number of extraordinary things happened. And I just called this, I just made space. I just disappeared. I failed to be there. And my absence engendered this extraordinary conversation. There was no expert from the University of Gastronomic Sciences in the room. There was no Mr. Professor. There was no David. And so by being absent, by having just not taken up space, I left an enormous amount of space for something else to happen. And so in failure, a different kind of success happened. But in failure, I also recognized, again, the problematics of occupying space, occupying power, when one is ostensibly trying to share and exchange and be equitable and equanimical. It just doesn't work all the time because whether or not we want it, we hold privilege and we hold power. So disappearance made space and made something else happen. And I was delighted, and my students were delighted after I recovered, that everything happened as it should have. And mostly it happened as it should have because I wasn't there. Earlier, actually, about a year before that, I was performing a very short series, a series of very short, what I called micro performances, 2 or 3 minute performances about 35 times a night at an arts festival in Washington, D.C. And this was a bit of an experiment for me. My research is largely based in systems and ecologies and design and performance particularly. And so for one of the first times, I really left behind a lot of my other practices and was a performer. I was an actor telling a story about fermentation and bread and death and memory, and how perhaps through bread making, an exchange of bread, and using live ferments like a pasta madre that I had inherited from a friend in Italy, that I could somehow rethink the way that humanness exists. And so in some ways, this was an investigation of how death is not death, but a continuation of life through other means. In that sense, death or life had failed, death had succeeded, but death was also a success. And the end of life, the failure of life, was also a positive thing because it engendered many other people to occupy the space that, in this case, my dead friend with the yeast starter had occupied. So in this context, I created a performance, 3-minute performance around yeast and bread making and sharing and storytelling. And it took place in a small tent-like enclosure in a courtyard in a public place in Washington, D.C. I brought the starter with me from Montreal in my bag. Somehow this starter really seemed to enjoy travel. And so as I got it into the kitchen of the place where I was staying, it exploded out of the jar. And I thought, oh, this is a bit of a mess, but how exciting. It's certainly a very successful looking starter. And it made some delicious bread in a way that I had never managed to make good bread at home in Montreal. So I thought, oh, there's something going on here. Gigi was the name of my friend who died, who gave me this starter. And then is also now the name of the starter. Gigi seemed to like travel. So I thought, oh, I'm going to start thinking about movement and meaning differently from now on. But what I did then during the performance was to share the bread, to tell the story of Gigi, to talk about the importance of fermentation, of bacterial life, and how humans are largely bacterial in many ways. And of course, we need our microbes in order to survive, in order to digest. And I painted my hand with the starter, and I made physical contact with the other person in front of me, and we talked and we shared. And some of us actually cried. And I thought in that moment, each time when I told the story of Gigi's death and I held the hand of the other person, breaking the third wall, or breaking the fourth wall of theater, that is, and feeling them, that in some way I was breaking the rules. I was failing to be a good performer. But I was also failing to be a good academic, and I was also failing to be an activist. I was failing in doing everything, and yet in some ways I was doing the best work I'd ever done. I got great reviews in the local press. I had a lot of criticism from the person who convened the performance. I had many people not want to touch my hand when I'd painted it with sourdough starter. And in that moment of not being an artist, not being an academic, being a philosopher, not being a philosopher, being a friend to someone who had died, being a semi-qualified, not very good bread maker, all of these spaces that had been closed to me sort of opened, but also closed at the same time. And again, I didn't know who I was or what I was doing. I was failing in multiple ways simultaneously, and yet many, many good things came out of that, including the reviews, including a sense of self, including a transition from academic to something else. And I wondered, in that moment, who was I to do all this? And I'm still wondering. But it kicked off a long process of reflection that has now, in fact, brought me to this moment. Later, and both earlier and later, in 2016 and 2018, I was in Timor-Leste in Southeast Asia. And Timor is a fascinating country with an incredibly complicated history. If you were alive in the 1970s, you would have heard and seen graffiti and protests calling for the freeing of East Timor, which at that point was occupied by the Indonesian army. But Timor has a long history, a long, very complicated history with colonialism, with exploitation, with political, civil, economic unrest and instability. It is a very challenged and challenging country. And I was there for as again a part of the Eco-Gastronomy Project, then later as an invited guest academic to participate in a new project called the Timor-Leste Food Innovators Exchange. And part of what we were doing was trying to encourage the Timorese to revalorize their own traditional and historical foods. Timor, having gone through multiple waves of colonialism, occupation, invasion, exploitation by other countries, had also had its food impacted by in multiple different ways. So whereas sorghum and millet may have been, yucca had been some of the earlier starch-based carbohydrate centers of their foodways, over time, first with the Portuguese, it had been replaced by corn, and then with the Indonesians, replaced by rice, and now in the independent era of Timor-Leste, their primary grain is wheat in the form of instant ramen noodles and highly processed white flour baked goods that are mostly imported from the United States and China. And so again, there's an exploitation taking place and a replacement of traditional foods. And so what we wanted to do was come back to a sense of Timorese identity as described through food and as practiced through food, because also many Timorese people suffer from undernutrition and malnutrition. So we were thinking through how can we do this, and part of what my practice involved in being there was about talking about storytelling. Storytelling as a useful way of remembering and refuturing one's foodways. And so we did a lot of talking about how could we structure some storytelling workshops to engage older people with memories of more traditional foodways and younger people with a taste for the new foodways but an interest in changing their country for the better. And we eventually got to this idea of storytelling. And so we encouraged people to bring foods with them, and we sat in a very beautiful location on an island just off the north coast of Timor called Atauro, and we held a number of storytelling workshops. And as we asked in Teton, the local language, for them to do conta história, which as it sounds has a certain Latin root in Portuguese, but is the Teton word for storytelling, they got confused and they said, well, conta história is about remembering accurately economic facts from one's family's history. And indeed, conta história is largely about, is a process of remembering family debt over time, and storytellers are people who recall the facts of family debt so that people can be paid appropriately in future generations. But conte storia has nothing to do with pride in food, and it doesn't have anything to do with futuring one's own food culture and future traditions and creating a beautiful new set of possibilities. It's sad. It's about recalling what was difficult. It's about potentially reenacting what was difficult in the future. And so we backed away from conte storia altogether and started talking about weaving, and how weaving together a future might be a new way of imagining Timorese food. But in this moment of my absolute wonderful confidence as being an international globe-trotting food studies academic who could bring storytelling and the glories of storytelling all over the planet, I suddenly realized I knew nothing. I knew nothing about what was really at stake in Timor. I was still an outsider despite my indoctrination into foodways, and despite my sharing of my open ideas and the possibilities of food creativity through performance and story, blah, 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 blah. And I finally just told myself to shut the hell up because I didn't know. And not knowing suddenly made it possible for me to know other things, and suddenly made it possible for other people to share and think and talk and do and feel. Because once again, like in Ecuador, I had just had to back off. So none of this is to say that what we often do in research in food systems needs to stop. That is, collect data, do research, analyze, produce results, write about it, talk about it, maybe make images about it. And I'm certainly not a science denier. I don't doubt science. My first degree was in chemical physics, and I understand how science produces results and how effective it can be and how dependent it is on apparatuses that are well structured and practiced and tested and legitimate. But what I think and what I hope we can do by incorporating a degree of failure or other non-sciencey ways of knowing and doing is to reboot the way we think about what food knowledge is and what food systems are and how matter and meaning and movement all together create a kind of set of knowledges that cannot only be known through positivism and correctness and success. And so I wonder, what can we do? What can we do next? I don't want to certainly prove anything with my work, but I do want to share one last example. It's because as I started thinking about that, I also started thinking, well, where did all this start? Well, it started a long time ago, but one of the culminating moments was when I finished my PhD. And I was at my defense, and many things happened. Many strange and wonderful things happened. One of the external readers, in fact, the glorious Lisa Helke, said, "David, I just have one question for you, and it's like, are you trying to take a God's eye perspective on food? Do you want to create a food cosmology? Because that's what I'm reading here." And I was like, oh dear, no, never meant to do that. Particularly because I'd written my dissertation from a largely autoethnographic perspective. And then another external examiner, who I won't name, asked me why I had taken such an incredibly narrow focus and why I was only writing about art from the perspective of the artist. And he ultimately turned to another one of my supervisors and said, I guess my statement is more, my question is more of a statement. It's just, fuck the artist. I want to know what the audience thought. So from one side, I had someone telling me that I was way too narrow, and from the other side, I had someone telling me I was maybe trying to be way too broad. And I thought, wow, my dissertation has failed in both directions. Rock on. And then the final moment came when, in fact, I was acknowledged as a doctor at this point, and my own supervisor hugged me, and a woman who had never shown emotion to me in her entire 4.5-year supervisory trajectory with me started crying and hugged me tighter than I've ever been hugged in my life and said, "Oh, David, you broke all the rules." Whereas I felt I had compromised on everything. So where in there is the truth? I don't know. I wonder now, how can we let science and philosophy and art and performance all play together and make mistakes and get messy and be failures together? And what if we enabled just people to follow, for example, sensible nutritional advice, but also follow their senses and eat things that make them sick and then eat things that make them well? What if we could have faith in our religious food guidances and old wives' and old husbands' tales of how food works and plays in our bodies? What about doing that without confirming it via science? What if we could just let our epistemic processes in food studies do what food itself does and be complex, be integrated, be systemic, be natural, be cultural, be industrial, be artisanal, and just be relational, including the relationships that we have with all of our failures? I've started wondering in the last, 3 or 4 months, whether the COVID pandemic, instead of killing off a large proportion, larger than it already has, of the planet and resetting our ways of being with our environmental, natural systems, I sort of wonder if COVID has just made us kind of tired of being successful, and whether that could be a really good thing. So I wonder if whether this sort of face punch or gut punch that the pandemic has brought might help broaden a perspective on failure, and that being on top or winning, getting it right, probably isn't necessarily the most important thing. I sort of wonder if we could, in having fallen down over the last couple of years, just not get up and see what the ground looks like for a while and see what it smells like and tastes like, rather than trying to process and exploit and succeed over and over and over again in ways that have clearly not been leading to a lot of planetary successes. So we'll see, as ever. And maybe then we can talk about what this could lead to, or why it isn't the right way for some of us. So there you go. Did I succeed in getting you to think positively about failure? If so, damn it. Or wait, did I fail in this attempt to promote failure in food? If so, rats. Whatever the case, sorry. Yeah, sure. Could I drop a few things? Yes.
sure that there are failures in that. Could you show me some of that in order to progress in the further? So I think my problem, I like your presentation. It's very thought-provoking, but I put a question mark to your strong opposition between the failure way of doing it, as you present, and then the old-fashioned, sort of positivistic or post-positivistic science.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think there is this.
Thank you. No, and indeed, there are places in which the scientific process, which I have practiced extensively over my career as well, can be useful and has demonstrated itself to be useful. Indeed, I'm very happy to have been vaccinated multiple times, and I'm not a science denier, and I understand very clearly the value of science. And so what I'm interested in is, however, is combining things, pluralism, rather than a single system process. Indeed, science engages with failure all the time, but it is a failure towards success. And that is what I'm trying to think about, is how could failure be towards more failure? How can failure be a different kind of positive outcome? So that's a starting point. And that's why, for example, Jack Halberstam's book, The Queer Art of Failure, is so valuable, because in imagining a twisted or queered interpretation of failure, it doesn't depend on it being in opposition to something else. So I'm not opposing failure to science. I'm saying failure it could be an addition in this queered sense rather than in the scientific sense. Part of my concern with science is, well, having practiced it. And I know that scientists, as part of larger systems of success-driven requirements, including funding, publishing, recognition, career advancement, science is never isolated from all the other social systems of the world. And so in those senses where success is often a way to cover up something, science fails in interesting ways. Science is not a thing, science is a practice. Science doesn't exist independent of human behavior. And so that's where I'm sort of trying to find some cracks to investigate how this idea of failure, and this is a very beginning sense of what failure might be, how it can play with science. Historically, science was not the be-all and end-all way of knowing things. We had other ways of doing. Science has been extraordinarily successful in many ways to do wonderful things. But my other question is, what's next? Science is the dominant form of knowledge making around the planet today. Religion used to be that. Before that, other practices were in place. And so each system of knowledge making can and probably should build on each other and play with each other. And this is why I wonder, how could religious belief, and I'm not religious at all, how could religious belief be an additional value with science rather than instead of? I just don't want to stop at science, because I suspect there's an awful lot more ways of knowing, and the successes of science tend to make us think that we should stop here. Makes a lot of people think that. Not everyone, and certainly many scientists don't think that. But the collective religion of science makes me a little nervous. Yeah. Yes, no, for sure. They produce different systems of knowledge. Yes. I believe it is, yeah. I think it's a kind of knowledge that has been undervalued since the advent of science as a dominant form of knowledge making. And I'm not saying that it is better. I'm not saying that it should replace. I'm saying that it could be with, and that with is something that science often resists. Okay. Yeah. Well, and this is, I don't expect this to be something that everyone agrees with. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in some ways, and I think, if I am hearing your question, I'm hearing your question in a way that I am interpreting as privilege. I'm standing at the front of a room talking to all of you. I'm a white man. I've got a PhD. I've got a ton of privilege to be able to talk about failure. I can do all these things and say them cheerfully and with confidence, and I also have I have a science training. I have a lot of privileges that enable me to talk about failure as failure, or in a context of an academic conference. I can drop my stuff and I can trip and I can play failure, and yet I've still succeeded in some ways, right? By my standing here, I'm succeeding, and by normative standards. And plenty of people do what you have described. I'm sorry, could you rename the person you spoke about? Okay, thank you. And position themselves as doing stuff that is good, talk about their work in positive or felicitous, or, this is the other challenge. There is a semiotic challenge within our language to describe these things effectively. And that's why I'd say failure is a positive outcome, another possible positive outcome. And I think what I've tried to do is name it. And I'm very much following Jack Halberstam's notion of queering of failure as a thing that could be mused upon, wondered about, explored, tested, tried out, talked about at a conference, and see what happens, rather than necessarily trying to convince or argue for or succeed in being a failure. So that's some of my responses to what you were saying, but I'm not sure that I'm actually answering a question specifically. Great. Yeah. Well, and this is it. I read this book and I just thought, something like I feel like I have about a 25% understanding of where the book is going, and this is why I'm trying to explore it and figure it out with other people as well, and see what it could lead to without necessarily having an idea. But thanks for your question or comment or statement. Mm. Oh, right, of course, yeah. I don't know. I have totally failed. I so I too as I said, my first degree was in chemical physics, which I loved, and I'd done science all through my high school career, and in Cégep, which is a kind of between high school and university construct in Quebec, and so I just kept doing it, and I got 2 years in, and I was like, yeah, I don't want to be getting into a very, very narrow focus for the rest of my career. I'm a generalist. I'd always been that. I'd always wanted to do all the stuff. And that pushed me ultimately away from a longer career in science. And so the next thing I did was I ran a catering company and did an art degree or an art diploma. And I think and then after that I did other stuff, and I did marketing, and then I was a consultant, and I worked for Kraft and Pepsi, and woohoo, that was an education and a half. And then I did a degree in gastronomy in Italy, which was extremely relational and very non-conventional in terms of its academic approach. And then I thought, well, could this be done in at a sort of PhD way? And that's where my supervisor said I'd broken all the rules, because I actually wasn't that disciplinary, but I was, by their standards, normatively successful. And I think in my experience, the layering together of things, and ultimately what I always say, it's about connection making. It's like, how does this system of thinking or this pattern or this symbol in physics relate in some interesting way to this symbol or this pattern or this practice in food or in communications? And certainly, I mean, if there's one through line, it's probably communications in my life. So I don't know that I have an answer, but I do know that my embodied experience with multiple different forms of practice, knowledge, doing, thinking, and sensing helps me make connections between different ideas and ways of doing. I do think, it's wonderful to always engage with the hands when we're doing food work, and the body and the mouth and other people's mouths and other people's bodies and other people's hands. And that by coming back to a very lived and embodied practice with food, we can then branch out into different ways of expressing it. So I would say coming back to material practice always, particularly in food, which is so fundamentally material but often gets discursivized very quickly, is a way to find communications, connections, and possibilities for all of us. If you're cooking or fermenting or infusing, That can lead to descriptions and expressions through science. That can lead to descriptions and expressions through emotions and bodily gesture. It can lead to poetry. It can lead to, I think, affect, which is very highly related to material practice for me, is, again, not a God's eye or grand unifying form of knowledge, but I think affect, which is so very hard to express in words, but we always know it when we feel it, is another strong tool for not unifying, but forming connections, linking, finding bridges, and particularly communications bridges for a lot of food science, food art, food practice. Maybe. Try it out, see what happens. You're already doing it. It's great. Hmm. Yes. Yeah, I think part of where I get stuck is what conventional or normative forms of success have led to. A lot of exploitation, a lot of oppression, a lot of usage of others towards my success, a lot of centralization of power to be good at whatever. And in being not good at, power gets redistributed, or power could be redistributed. My example from Ecuador, when I got sick and almost died, great things happened. And during the beginning of COVID, when a lot of people in urban centers were not driving cars, a lot of good things happened. Wildlife resurged, like all sorts of other stuff happened that seemed really positive. And the idea of trying to control and centralize and be legitimate and succeed often prevents other things from succeeding or doing well. And if you ladder back all of this, success, failure, blah, 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 for me, the question is always, well, why is humanity and human existence the primary marker of success? Well, because we're humans. The answer is obvious. But if we were to be able to take a slightly distanced perspective on our own framework of reality, we might say, as the machines in the Matrix do, that we're a pretty horrible virus that should be eradicated because all we're doing is consuming and reproducing, and that's not really very good for this ecosystem. So, yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so what's happening next, just so you know, is you've seen the program that the next plenary speaker is online only, so that's predominantly for the online audience. You can watch that at your own time, because for you people here in person, we're going to two parallel sessions. And those sessions, like all the sessions, will be on the fifth floor. So you can take
Okay, so we're now going to be moving on to our next plenary session. Hi.
Hi, Kyla.
Hey there.
Hello.
Meet you, I'm Bill. So, yeah, they've asked me to kind of kick off and introduce you. So that should be, we'll wait another 4 minutes or so, Kayla, yes, to give people a chance to come in.
I will ask Tamsin quickly, whether we should
No,
start.
we should wait because it's on the schedule as 9:30. You don't
Okay.
have to ask them.
Okay.
Yeah, let's just, yeah.
Can I test to see if I can share my screen?
Yeah,
Yes,
of course.
yes, please do, yeah.
Let me see. You can see it, right?
Yes.
Yep, looking perfect. Yep, wonderful.
And then
Okay.
once you start, I'll also spotlight your video so it's shown on the side.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to. Okay, so we have a few more minutes, right? So we
Yeah.
can-
Yeah, about 3, and we might
Yeah.
start at 9:31. Are you? Which time zone are you in? Are you in the?
I'm in
you're
Toronto. I'm EST, so it's 10:30, 10:27 right now here.
Oh, it's 10:30. Okay, no, I'm in Central, which is it's 9:30 here. So yeah, okay. So at 31 past the hour, we'll get started. So thank you very much for joining us. That's great. What we find is that a few people come to them synchronously, but because of all the world's time zones, and people are getting very used to this asynchronous thing now. So the most important part is the recording, which then goes as part of the whole conference record as well. So that's important. So yeah.
I think we're being recorded right now. Our discussion here is recorded.
Yeah, but
Why
I think
would
you'll edit it, won't you, Kayla?
We're actually streaming onto YouTube, and so the entire recording will be automatically uploaded. But we'll add timestamps for when each session starts.
Okay, so
Okay, got it.
because this might not be interesting for for anybody.
No. But I think these days people got used to the fact that everything in the world starts like this, and a messy hello, good morning, where are you, what's the weather like, what's the time where you are kind of conversation. That's the way the world is now. So,
It's the way things are, yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, so I'll be back in 3 minutes then, 2 minutes.
Come back in 3 minutes and I'll do the same.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody. Good to see you all. If you're I'm in the US at the moment, so it's the morning here, and good to see you all wherever you are in the world. A little bit of introduction. I'm going to introduce our speaker, but an introduction to myself first. My name is Bill Cope. I I work in education at the University of Illinois, but I've been involved with this Common Ground Research Networks project since it began. So it's a, people probably know it's a not-for-profit, where what we do is we take issues which require cross-disciplinary research, thinking about where things are going in the world. And food is a very good example of this, where you can't deal with it except in a cross-disciplinary kind of way. And also, it's an area where some parts of universities which don't traditionally have research cultures are getting involved in research cultures as well. So, you know, I work at the University of Illinois, I work in education. I happen to have some of my students who work in the culinary area who are doing work around pedagogies for teaching food studies or for teaching what was traditionally called culinary arts. So that's a little bit about me. But it's but I'll also mention a couple of things about the format of the conference as well. It's probably been mentioned already, but I'll mention it again. I think most of the people who will be attending this session will be attending it not in a synchronous way, so it's being recorded. So I'm just full disclosure, it's being recorded. It's actually being live streamed on YouTube as well. And then the recording is going to be put into the conference website, where we would really like you to continue the discussion. That's really, really important. There's limited time and space for discussion here on the web. Kayla, a quick question, by the way. What time should we finish this session? Does it run into another session? I just want to get the time frame correct for the session.
The session will be for an hour until 11:30 Eastern time.
Oh, okay, great, excellent. Well, that means we do have time for us who are here live to ask some questions, but then after that, please continue the discussion in the online space. I think from Kayla, I usually know these numbers in advance, but I know there's about 100 people at the conference. Do you know the numbers, Kayla? It's a mixture of online.
Yeah, I think it is about 100, like you said.
Yeah. So I'll introduce Kayla while I'm here as well, and also so Kayla is keeps the online show on the road and is one of the people at Common Ground who really put a lot of work in. There's a lot of preparatory work in organising these conferences, and Kayla is one of the Common Ground team. So yes, that's just to introduce her. Now, the format is this. It's a blended conference, so some of the sessions are in person, some of the participants are purely online. So what we would ask you to do is, you know, there are certain advantages in being online. So we ask the in-person people, if it's at all possible, to be sure to put a digital version of their talk in, something they've pre-recorded. For the benefit of the online people, but also we ask everybody, whether they're online or in person, to go into the online version and there to discuss. So in reality, there isn't a lot of space for discussion in an in-person session, but there's open discussion in these kinds of online spaces. So one of the important things, though, is I always say this to people: please do not leave one of the online sessions without leaving a comment, and preferably a substantive one, you know, not just, wow, that was great. So, you know, and what that does, just to tell you in terms of how our software works, that does trigger an email because it's asynchronous and other people are not going to be there to be talking at the same time. It triggers an email to the presenter who can then, you know, come back and join the conversation. So actually, there's an ongoing dialogue that's established with that. Okay, that's a little introduction about the format. In case I think a lot of you know it already, but I'm going to you know, just to remind people. So it's our great pleasure today. I'll do a brief introduction. I'm going to work off the formal description to our presenter. To have speaking with us Irina Mihalache. I don't know whether I pronounced that. I almost certainly pronounced it incorrectly. You know, she's an associate professor and director of museum studies at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. She's co-edited a book on food and museums, which brings together, very, very cross-disciplinary, just the way I said at the beginning, where it involves museum professionals, artists, chefs, to reflect on the intersections between food and museums. She's written a number of scholarly chapters and articles in the area of art museums, women's work in role, women's committees in art museums, culinary work, museum restaurants, menus and interpretation, and a lot of, quite an important body of work in this area. And she, in 2018, she co-curated the exhibition Mixed Messages, Making and Shaping Culinary Culture in Canada. So that's only the beginning of the work that Irina has done. And I'd like to, it's my great pleasure now to introduce you all to Irina, who I think will get started and share her screen. Thank you for being here. Thank you everyone for being here.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I will share my screen. I was debating if I should have a presentation or not, but because I'm going to be talking about specific menus, I think it's going to be really important for all of you to see what I'm talking about. Plus, it's a collection of menus that haven't really seen the public eye so far. So hopefully you are as excited about it as I am. So if you give me just one second, I will share the screen. Okay, and I presume everybody can see it. And let me see.
Yep, we can see it well.
Okay, let me just see if I can make it a tiny bit bigger. Okay, so I wanted first to, before I delve into the topic, just to thank a couple of people for me being here, definitely the organizers and the planning folks such as Tasmin and Kyla. But I also wanted to thank Kathy and Peter just for trusting that my research is sufficiently connected with the theme of the conference, which is Imagining the Edible, Food Creativity and the Arts. And pretty much I'm very grateful for the opportunity to return to something that I call right now a pre-pandemic dream, which is to think through a collection of restaurant menus, some of which you can actually see here on this slide, that were gifted to me by a friend who used to manage the culinary team at an art museum restaurant in Toronto in the 1980s. So I have been doing research on the culinary history of the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is actually Toronto's largest art museum since 2014. But this collection of menus was actually my first opportunity to encounter what I call a slice of the restaurant history. So it's my first opportunity to speak about this collection with all of you. What's interesting that the museum's archives do not collect items that are related to the museum's restaurant, which it's a fascinating and frustrating reality in itself, which is also indicating that the museum's food spaces, despite the fact that they are fully integrated architecturally with the restaurant, are not seen as participating to the cultural work that the museum is doing to make them worthy to be preserved in an archive. But that's a topic for another presentation. So what I'm here to do today is to share with you my first set of reflection inspired by this small collection. And what you'll notice is that because this is very new research, some ideas are going to be fully formed and fully rounded, some less. I'm going to be asking also a lot of questions. So I'm really excited also about the conversation. But before I get into my topic, I would like to actually start the right way, which is with a land acknowledgement. And what you can see on the screen is actually the official land acknowledgement of the University of Toronto. But I started to work on personalizing my land acknowledgement according to the type of research that I'm doing, and to really be mindful of the research that I do in the context of a settler colonial country. So the lands on which I'm currently located continue to be cared for, stewarded, and lived on by many nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I'm joining you from Toronto, and Toronto used to be called, or is called in the Mohawk language, Takaronto, and that means where there are trees standing in the water, Toronto being right by Ontario, one of the largest lakes in this area, Ontario Lake. And the lands where I'm situated on are protected by the dish with one spoon, wampum peace agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and also Treaty 13. And as a research settler to Turtle Island, I arrive here willingly, and I benefit from the many facets of my identity. Why is it important for me, at least, to center my research as a land acknowledgement? It's because I work for a very large university, and I also research museums, and these institutions were and continue to be directly implicated in projects of settler colonialism. Indigenous systems of knowledge and caring for the land have been threatened by colonialism, and if today we see these beautiful practices re-emerging, it is because of Indigenous brilliance, survival, creativity, and resistance. And my research centers on food and culinary history. And as I'm sure all of us are aware of, archival and historical research is full of gaps. Some might be intentional, some are not. Absences, omissions, and this reflects a way in which cultural communities have been erased from institutional memory. And I believe that it's important whenever we research cooking, feeding, eating, growing food as a system of practices, especially when they are institutionalized. In my case, I'm looking at restaurants in museums. We have to interrogate their complicity in this broader settler colonial systems. So I wanted to start in this way before I delve into my topic. So in the same way in which art museums develop strategy for looking at art and cultures, they also created expectations around foods through restaurant spaces and menus that are the backbone of art museum restaurants. So in today's talk, I'm focusing on menus from the 1980s, as I said, from the Art Gallery of Ontario's main restaurant. And I find the 1980s to be an ideal time in the history of this particular museum to look at its foods, because the museum has just undergone one full decade of major transformations in terms of its architecture, exhibition practices, collections, but also related to hospitality. So before the 1970s, the AGO, and I'm going to refer to this museum as the AGO, so I don't have to spell out the name every single time, did not have official eating spaces. That doesn't mean that it didn't have a very rich culinary history. It had numerous culinary events and programs all the way since the 1920s and the 1930s, but these programs were ran by volunteer women's committees, and food was served at opening of events in more informal spaces. The Women's Committee also developed citywide collaborations around food for fundraising purposes. And it is actually the food-centric vision of these women's organizations that brought chefs such as Diane Lucas and James Beard to Toronto for the first time in the 1960s. So the museum was highly implicated in, or highly involved in, culinary networks. But today I'm not looking at what happened before the 1970s. I'm much more interested in the moment when restaurants became formal physical spaces with permanence within the museum. And that is the 1970s. And the 1970s is also important to think about because many other museums in North America in the 1970s were going through major transformations, and they were building new and beautiful, modern-looking eating spaces, often in very visible locations. And they were bringing thus the infrastructure of the hospitality industry within art spaces. So the AGO embraced this change by repurposing a central area of the museum into a restaurant. in a way, this restaurant never quite found its identity, right? Which is something that I explore specifically with this menu, that it never really felt like it fit, or that it was comfortable, or that it was fully supported and integrated within the mission and the vision of the museum until mid-1920s, which again, I won't be able to touch on today, but if anybody's curious, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But what I will argue today is that for a brief period of time, in the 1980s, the AGO restaurant did what an art museum restaurant was trusted to do by the institution. So it had a very institutional-driven mandate to connect art with food and expand the museum experience through dining. And this translation of the curatorial mindset through food sadly also perpetuated forms of exclusion and elitism that characterize the museum as a whole at that particular moment in time. What's also interesting about this decade of transformation, which is the 70s, is that it brought into the museum a set of culinary professionals that were new, or a set of professionals that were new to a museological space, which is a culinary team. There has not been, before the 1970s, a community of culinary professionals within the art museum. And the first reference that I was able to find to the culinary team of the AGO was in a 1974 annual report. And at that particular moment of time, we have a team of 12. We have a manager for the dining room, a secretary, bookkeeper, an assistant manager, hostess, a head chef, a cook, 3 kitchen staff, and 4 cafeteria staff. So that's not an insignificant number, right? A team of 12 is actually quite a big shift in terms of the professional structure of an organization. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to explore these menus as expressions of material culture. And I have a couple of frameworks that I'm using to ground my reading of these menus. So before we get to look at more menus and to think about them, I'm going to introduce you to these frameworks. So first, I understand the menus as the products of the creative practices of a team of culinary professionals. I always, when I think about museum practices, I think about the people who produced, but also enacted the menu through preparation, cooking, plating, hosting, and serving the food that is promised on a menu. And this is the starting point in my framework, and it's possibly the most difficult knot on my research spectrum, because knowledge about professionals who work in museums, especially historical knowledge, and who are not curators or directors or board members, is very difficult to locate. And that has to deal with the hierarchical structure of museums, the way that information is structured and communicated. Like even today, if you go to the AGO's website and you look at the current restaurant, which is called the AGO Bistro, the only person featured on that specific website is a chef. Nobody else is visible or made visible. So certain communities of practice have been and continue to be more visible than others, as I just explained. The culinary team at the AGO, at least until the 1970s, is very impossible to locate unless their names are recorded in annual reports. And generally, the literature on museum studies, despite the fact that my field is highly interdisciplinary and highly critical, does not spend a lot of time untangling the realities of the people who work in museums, unless they are attached to the very visible jobs, such as curator. So, and I would also, make an argument that maybe it's a little bit bold, that probably many people who work in museums in jobs that relate to traditional roles in museums would probably not think about culinary team as being their peers or as having the same role in doing museum work. And that's something that I want to challenge through my research. And I want to make space and advocate for the stories and the contributions of people who are cooking in museums as being museum professionals as well as culinary professionals. So my second framework thinks about the very specific context of the museum restaurant. which I believe to be a culinary place that is located within a larger cultural ecosystem, which has its own logic, communities of practice, ways of knowledge sharing. There might or might not be congruent with the presence of food or of a food space. So bringing a restaurant inside a museum implies an alignment of values and practices, which also include financial and monetary considerations. And sometimes bringing a restaurant within a museum might take away the food's power to be a community builder or a community connector or an intercultural bridge. So in the past few decades, museum restaurant, especially in art museums, and I'm quite curious if anybody here has recent memories of being in an art museum restaurant, but they have been conceptualized as very creative and innovative spaces, oftentimes offering upscale dining experience and forms of experimentation. And looking at this slice of history from the 1980s, it's interesting to understand how the vision for the restaurant in the 1980s is continued or discontinued or challenged in the way in which museums think about their restaurant today. Third, I reflect on the menus in relation to the infrastructures of the urban environments where they are situated. So a museum restaurant is comfortably or uncomfortably located inside art spaces. It is also part of a global and local network of food businesses, right? It sources produce, meat, spices, wines from food terminals, markets, farms, alongside with all the other food spaces within the city. And it might not be possible to understand the decisions that were made necessarily and how specific ingredients, for example, made their way into the restaurant. But we have significant knowledge about how the food systems operated in a space like Toronto to be able to try to fit this restaurant and to understand what role it had in the larger network. And at the same time, we also think about this museum as being part of the broader museum restaurant community in Toronto. So it's important to also think about what was the landscape of similar restaurants at the same time in Toronto or even in cities similar to Toronto. And lastly, I also think about the space, the cultural makeup of the space when these restaurants emerged. So the AGO sits at the intersections between numerous neighborhoods in Toronto, including Chinatown West. The museum itself has a provincial mandate, which means that it aims to service the entire province of Ontario, which is a very, very large space, which also includes some of the most diverse cities and areas in Canada, including Scarborough, Toronto, Markham, and so on. And the museum is also located on Indigenous lands, which it recognizes that currently in the 1980s, there wasn't really a practice of land acknowledgement or a realization or a confronting of the colonial past, but nonetheless, it sits on these very complex historical and contemporary spaces. So this begs the questions that we would ask about the museum. Who is this museum for? Who is the museum restaurant for? Who visits the museum? Who dines in the museum restaurant? Who doesn't recognize the museum restaurant as a space where they feel welcome or they identify with? So needless to say, thinking with all these lenses and frameworks and layers is part of what I call a very slow research process. And it is a process that requires thinking about a triad, which is a context, a human, and the material culture. And this thinking needs to happen together, at least if I'm to achieve some of my research questions and my research goals. And I find that thinking through this triadic frame or set of frameworks allows me to challenge something that really frustrates me in academic literature, but also in professional practice, which is a hyper abstract thinking around museum that tends to frame these institutions as ideological, monolithic entities that are unable to change, rather than places where people come and work on a daily basis. And some of these people happen to be culinary professionals. So my approach to thinking about these menus is mindful of the difficulties of doing daily work, which includes a culinary, within a highly complex hierarchical space that is a museum. The fact that I'm looking through this framework doesn't deny the ideological mandates of these institutions and their complicity in colonialism, cultural misrepresentation, white supremacy, and other forms of racism. But it helps to provide a fuller story of the institution and of the restaurants at a very specific moment in time. So it allows us to actually understand how all these ideological constraints and constructs were actually being enacted or challenged on a daily basis. Okay, so let's go to the menu. So what you see here before I move on is this was a general menu for the restaurant from early, I think it's around 94. I wasn't able to date it, but it's between 1994 and 95. And this is the main cover of the menu, and I'm gonna walk you through the content of the menu. But before I go there, as I said that I center humans and professionals in my research, I would like to introduce you here to the people who actually worked in the museum, who would have developed the menu, managed the restaurant, and also produced and served the food in 1984 and 1985. And this is actually and I apologize if the image is a little bit, there's some pockets that are a little blurry. I wasn't able to return to take better pictures because the archives just recently reopened. But this is a page from an annual report, and I find annual reports to be extremely useful in research that's not documented otherwise, because the back of an annual report tells you everybody who worked in a museum at a specific moment in time. So it's interesting because I mentioned earlier that in 1994, the culinary team at the AGO was composed of 12 people. In 1984, which is about 10 years after the first restaurant opened, it more than doubled. And it also started to involve part-time staff, right? So there could be some thinking here, around maybe the precarity of the food industry in the 1980s. We can make some assumptions if we delve into other bodies of literature. But if we stick to this, to this list, I think something that's important to note is that we see here the dining services as being their own department, which is usually not very common in museums, which also tells us that the museum is, investing a lot of capacity and resources into having these culinary spaces. Oftentimes, what a more common model in art museum is that the museum outsources its dining services to either an external hospitality, or it rents the space for a restaurant to come in. However, at the AGO at the time, the dining services were a department within the organization, just like you would have the education department or the curatorial department. So I think that's important to note. It occupies an official space within the institution. It's also interesting to see that it follows a very traditional administrative model, reminding us perhaps of the idea of the French brigade. There's a manager, there's the executive chef and a sous chef. So it is a very traditional kind of understanding of a restaurant structure. And there's other things that we can see here, but before I talk a little bit about that, I just wanted to state that I don't actually have stories, and I haven't managed to talk to anybody who worked at the AGO at the time, except for the person who has trusted me with these collections of menus. So it's hard to make assumptions, right, about the people just looking at a name. But at the same time, I think just on a very cursory look, we can see that it appears to be quite a diverse group of people who work in the culinary team. We don't know much about what their experiences would have been. We don't know if their experience was one of inclusion rather than just diversity, if there was equity in the kitchen at the time. But there's a very kind of a very interesting, I think, set of interpretations we can make looking at the group of humans who are part of the culinary team. So I just wanted to introduce you to the AGO menu. So the menu is, this would have been the menu that visitors could order from for lunch and dinner. It has, in many ways, kind of a very traditional structure. It starts with the appetizers and the soup. I'll leave it here just for a second so you get a sense of the type of dishes that you would be able to encounter. It's also interesting to look at this menu in conversation with other menus from other similar restaurants in the 1980s, but also to think about the type of kind of cultural influences that would make their way into the menu. So it has appetizers and soups, and then I'm going to go to the next screen to allow you to see what are some of the main dishes, the entrees. And it's quite interesting that there's an entire page here that's dedicated to egg dishes. But when I look at this menu, and I'm curious to see what other people are thinking, I'm seeing the theme of kind of French-inspired dishes. So even if dishes that maybe are a little bit more, North American or Canadian, there's a very interesting kind of French twist. So, for example, the Grange burger is served with sauce Choron, and the sauce Choron was a sauce that was the Béarnaise sauce that included tomato paste that was developed by a very famous French chef. You see the very famous Belle Meunière, but it's made with halibut, which is a fish that can be found in Canada. And so you see this very kind of interesting intersection between what we might consider to be a Canadian menu, but at the same time surrounded by a French kind of a nod to the French haute cuisine. So it's very, I think it's very interesting to read those tensions and those intersections on the menu. And we can also find some more I'm saying traditional as in more expected types of dishes. So a Caesar salad or a Greek salad or a salade niçoise. So it is a menu that is truly kind of, it's well-rounded. I consider it to be a very well-rounded menu, but it is also a menu that suggests a transformation according to what might be perceived as the expectations of people who come and dine in a restaurant that is located in a museum, right? So a burger is more than just a burger. It has a French sauce. The salade niçoise is also something that wasn't very common on other restaurant menus of the same kind at the time. So you see dishes that are alluding to that kind of the allure of, fine dining, which is what I consider to be a bit of a translation of the curatorial experience within the restaurant. And I didn't include here the list of desserts because I wanted to stop a little bit at something that I think was a very common practice, or is now a very common practice in art museums, to differentiate the art museum restaurant from other restaurants that would have served similar foods. And this is the restaurant menu that is developed to be inspired by specific exhibitions. So I'm just going to highlight two of these, and then I'm going to wrap up just to make sure that we have time for conversation. But that's one of the most straightforward ways in which we see that process of translation between the curatorial and the culinary. And I think something for us to be very important, and this would require looking at the context of the museum, is what are the exhibitions that are selected to be translated on the menu. And I didn't have a chance here to delve deep into what would have been on display at the AGO at that time, but in the 1980s, the AGO was displaying a lot of global art. So it had shows that brought here exhibitions that let's focus on South Asian art, exhibitions also that focused on some elements of African art. However, what you see reflected on the restaurant menu is usually the very traditional European cuisines. So here, for example, you have a menu that was developed for the Dutch painting of the Golden Age exhibitions, which was on display in 1983. And this is the menu that was part of that exhibition. So something that you might see here is that some of the dishes from the general menu make their way here. So this would have been dishes that were either very popular with customers or dishes that the culinary team thought would be closer to the cultural context of that was supposed to be represented on the menu. So you see the Grange burger with sauce choron. We also see the salmon that reappears here, but then we also see dishes that, in this particular case, represent a translation of the Dutch culture, right? So the other important way to read this menu is to think about the idea of collaboration. So in this particular menu was a collaboration between the AGO and many other institutions. Some of them are culinary, some of them are diplomatic. So we can actually read this menu as a form of culinary diplomacy. We are not talking here about collaborations with community organizations or restaurateurs, people who, for example, live in Toronto, but were able to actually provide the expertise, the the grounds up expertise to be able to develop this menu. And one interesting dish that I wanted to emphasize here is a rishtafel, which is a colonial dish, right? The Dutch colonized Indonesia for a very long period of time, and one of the dishes that was born out of this process of colonization was a rishtafel, which makes its way on this particular menu. So we can only think about the ways in which this menu maybe could have been different if the AGO at the time would have collaborated maybe with a local Indonesian restaurant that could have possibly told a different story on this menu. But right now we are kind of at this level of high level partnership between the Art Gallery of Ontario and very large either political or diplomatic or beer entities. Another menu that was translated, or another exhibition that was translated, or another artifact that was translated on the menu was Venus of Syracuse. And Venus of Syracuse was part of an exhibition of Greco-Roman art that was displayed in Toronto in 1982. And here what you see is actually the front cover of the menu, and this is the back cover of the menu. So you have a little bit of a label to interpret the art on the menu itself. And here you can actually see the menu, which also shows its signs of use and decay, because it is a little bit stained. So we don't know if somebody maybe dropped a little bit of water on it. That's another mystery of material culture. But you can see here again the interpretation of technically the Venus of Syracuse, right? It's a Greco-Roman sculpture. Here you have a menu that is, it's more kind of Italian in style, but also brings in some elements of the menu that we noticed before. So I wanted you to kind of to have an idea of these two examples that were quite popular. So I wasn't able to include obviously all the elements of the collection, but there would have been maybe between 4 and 5 themed menus, if not more, throughout the year, which I think if we think from the perspective of a culinary team, this is a lot of change and knowledge, right? To be able to represent 4 or 5 different cultures in a menu in 1 year without a lot of time to actually understand how can cultural representation on a menu actually elevates the complexities of culture. I think that's quite a daunting task for any culinary team, but it was a very specific way in which museum restaurants try to pursue clients about how they are special and how they are connected and relevant to the to the museological experience. So a few concluding thoughts, that I'm looking at these menus as one of the first attempts to to institutionalize this relation between food and art. And I center the work of I want to ground this translation in the work of a culinary team that is maybe asked to to produce menus that might be beyond their expertise. So there's a lot of, I think, imagination here, or imagining as to what would be an Italian menu that is supposed to somehow represent the essence of the artwork or the essence of the of the exhibition. I think here, for example, we actually have on this menu a salad that actually is named after the Venus of Syracuse, which was also known as Venus Landolina, based on the archaeologists who discovered it. So we see these moments of imagining other cultures as an entryway into developing a very specific museological experience through a set of menus. So I'm gonna close here, and thank you very much for indulging me in this conversation. I'm also gonna stop sharing so I can see all of you.
Okay, well, look.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's sort of very interesting work. And I like the idea of, the sense that you're dealing with material culture in a number of sense, menus and foods, and yeah, it's complicated. So yeah, thank you very much. Now, what I'd like to do is open it up to questions, and there are 2 ways you can question. One is you can type a question in the chat, or comment, by the way, not just questions, or you can put up your hand and we'll get you to ask a question. So does anybody have any questions there? And by the way, if you do make a comment or a question, just introduce yourself first and tell us who you are. I've got a couple of things I'd like to say, actually, which is, I think you did mention this, which is the role of integrating the aesthetics and the intellectual project of the museum with the art itself. But the other question I was going to ask is food as art. To what extent can food be art? And as you were speaking, I was reminded of the work of Peter Sellers. I don't know, do you know Peter Sellers' work? Peter Sellers is an opera director who's worked with John Adams and done a number of operas, including Nixon in China and a whole, a major American opera person who's worked jointly with John Adams, who's a major composer. Anyhow, one of his interests, I've sort of circumstantially became involved with him because I'm an Australian, and before I came to the US and started working at the University of Illinois, he curated the Adelaide Festival, where he wanted food to be part of the festival experience and part of the art. And I actually, while you were talking, I went and looked up this little video where Peter Sellers, who's also a professor at UCLA, is talking about food as art. So my question to you is, to what extent could food be integrated more strongly with the art experience, food as art itself, and the art of the culinary arts? I mean, people use this phrase culinary arts, as opposed to something you do after you finish looking at the art. So, yeah.
I think that's a very good question. I'm gonna go back to the material that I've looked at, and because the idea of food as art is something that I've been thinking about, but I don't think that with these particular menus, if I'm gonna go by the menus and by what the archival materials are telling me, we are not there yet where an art museum restaurant is making arguments about the food as art, which is something that today is quite common. There are many very upscale restaurants in museums that are not only seeing themselves as a representation of or a translation, but they actually make arguments that they are art in themselves. And that happens by sometimes either doing partnership with artists, like doing culinary partnerships that are edible with art. Like I'm thinking here more about the edible rather than the art that happens in the gallery. I'm staying within the realm of the restaurant, but there are some restaurants right now that have fully embraced the idea that, so just to give you an example, there's a restaurant that's San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where for a while they actually reproduced. So they took iconic dishes from around the world, thinking like Ferran Adria type of dishes, and they looked at them as work of art and they reproduced them on the menu. So people who cannot go to Ferran Adria's restaurants can go to SF MoMA and eat an artistic creation. So I don't think that in the case of this menu, we see that, which is interesting because we are at the time, I think right before we start to see the idea of food as art fully integrated within the restaurant menu. So I think here, if I'm thinking about chronology, we are at a period where we see translation. So we see food trying to translate curatorial or artistic ideas from the exhibition into a menu by co-opting kind of cultural representation. So what's Italian food on a menu? What is Dutch food on a menu? What is Spanish food on a menu, right? Which I think it's a step before we start to talk about food as art.
Yeah, okay. No, they're all good points. And, you're dealing with also historical practices, which is, archival stuff. So, the field is certainly changing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have a comment or a question? Of course, I think probably a lot of the discussion is going to happen if in the asynchronous version of this, the video. But anyone have a comment or a thought or a question or a reflection? Okay. Sunday morning, people are in the mood for listening, not necessarily in the mood for talking. I understand that. Look, just one more question I was going to ask you, actually, which is a perennial one. So I started by kind of laughing at the prices on the menu, but then I thought, the reality is that, one of the critiques generally of art institutions is their class basis, which is, there's a class nature to the food as well, which is it's kind of fancy food. So if you go to the football, you're going to get hot dogs or something. I'm just wondering this, and also restaurants in galleries are a bit pricey, you know what I mean? Unless we can transport ourselves back to 1980 something or other. So, what do we do about that?
Well, I think that's okay. So I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I think one way to understand why these restaurants were, so the restaurants generally made their way into art museum at a time when art museums started to think of themselves as not only local players, but global institutions. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, we started to see this feeling of competition between different museums who are kind of not fighting, but who are trying to differentiate themselves on in a very crowded cultural space that had not only museums, but all sorts of other institutions. So one way in which art museums dealt with this problem is by using restaurants as kind of not tourist locations, but attractions in themselves. So at the AGO, for example, the restaurant came into being and resources were integrated into the restaurant. After they did this, they hired this big consulting agency to tell them what foods they should have within the restaurant. So the idea was that if we have a spectacular restaurant that has this kind of global attractive menu, we will be able to, to elevate ourselves. So in a way, the way in which museum restaurants was unfairly positioned with museums or spaces for consumption that comes with a price. And I think that's just a legacy that the field needs to deal with, because that's how restaurants came into being in museums. Some things that a lot of museums have been doing to try to kind of decolonize and democratize these practices, to either start collaborations with like either small restaurants or festivals, so to make space within their own spaces for more grassroots community organizations that can cook their food and sell their food. But they also started to create more informal casual spaces. So if you go to a larger art museum, you're probably going to have 4 or 5 different restaurants. Some of them are more upscale. So they, but the problem then is that, oftentimes the smaller coffee shops are located in the basement, and they don't have the same type of care and energy that you would find in an upscale restaurant that is, front and center at the level of the street or positioned within one of the best areas in the restaurant. So I think it's, on one side, it's a legacy of how this restaurant started to exist in museums, but it's also a legacy. Like sometimes I find that restaurants often push back the work of museums to be more inclusive and more democratic, because they have these very kind of elitist and high-class legacies that are also financial. I mean, when we talk about museums, they are financial institutions. They have to think about money as much as they have to think about the experience that they provide visitors. So it's this very complex historical context, but also reality of what it means to operate an institution. I noticed there was a question.
There's a question there for Marion Geiger if you'd like to have a quick. I can read it out if you like. Thank you for a wonderful and inspiring presentation. Was it difficult to access the archive material?
It wasn't as much difficult to access. It was more difficult to find them, because the more that I do research about restaurants, and I've done research about restaurants in multiple museums, they haven't really been information and knowledge about food in museums hasn't been intentionally collected. So it is now, because for the last 20 to 30 years, right, food studies became a field, food became more important. So if you go in the last 20 to 30 years, you start to find information about restaurants. But other than that, it's almost impossible. You have to truly do a lot of lateral research and hope that if you read minutes from a meeting, you will find a report that comes from the restaurant. So you have to really do a lot you have to have a lot of patience and dedicate a lot of time to doing creative archival research, which I guess is part of doing archival research. But I think what I think is very interesting is that we see a shift. So I'm, probably 100 years from now, if somebody looks back at this moment, you're going to start to find in archives, sections that are dedicated to food in museums. And I think that's also because of the work that all of us are doing together to emphasize how important it is to think about any institutions through the lens of food. So thank you, Marian, for that question.
Thank you. Okay, we're only a few minutes off the end of the session now. Does anybody else have a comment or a question you'd like to make? Put up your hand or type it in the chat. Well, look, I want to thank you very much for a very informative talk. A lot of things which I've got to confess I haven't really, thought about in quite these ways. So thanks for giving us that kind of enlightening set of perspectives. And there's lots of cross-cutting lessons here, which apply to a lot of other domains as well. So thank you very, very much for that. I want to remind everybody both on the video who's watching, if you're watching this as recording, but also the live session people, is please go in and keep the discussion running in the chat area beneath this recording. But I also want to thank Kayla and the Common Ground team for getting us here today and having it all set up. And thank you all for being here on a Sunday morning, particularly you, Irina, to give a lively and engaging presentation on a Sunday. So that's really very much appreciated. So folks, see you all from the rest of the conference, through the rest of the conference, whether you're in person or online, dealing with the asynchronous sessions or the synchronous sessions, and have a great conference. So bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
See you then. Bye. Bye. Bye.